Well, I'd say two things. One is Dr. Eastman, if you look at his whole record, he's very much a man of principle and a man not afraid to call it like he sees it. So when he makes a comment like that, it's not some sort of strategy. That's what he really thinks. I think when you look at the trial, the issue that's going to be presented perhaps someday to a Georgia jury is, was there a good faith basis to challenge various aspects of the 2020 election? And did Dr. Eastman and the other defendants bring those challenges in good faith? And we're confident the answer will be absolutely yes. Well, I'll say this about the former vice president is I think the former vice president, let's look at what were his incentives here around January 6th. He really had two choices, right? He could have said, Dr. Eastman, you may have a point, but I just don't think there's any evidence of fraud or illegality here, as you were suggesting earlier. There would have been nothing inconsistent about that. But the problem for Vice President Pence would be, for obvious reasons, that would be significantly disadvantageous to any future political campaign such as he's now undertaking. The second option the vice president had, which was the one he ultimately chose, was to say, yes, I agree there was evidence of illegality and fraud, which he said publicly at the time, but I think the Constitution has tied my hands, so I can't do anything about it. And the consequence of taking that approach on January 6th is it aligns the vice president's interests directly in opposition to Professor Eastman. And I can't read his mind, but he has an incentive to do everything he can to discredit everything Dr. Eastman said at the time. And the statement you just quoted is very much along those lines. And I think that's very important context for anyone evaluating this case to appreciate. All I can say is I can't read the vice president's mind. I don't know what his internal discussions were, but at a trial, the question going to be presented to the jury is what were the incentives? And I think it's clear, I don't think it's even debatable, that the vice president and his allies have an incentive to discredit as best they can the theories that Dr. Eastman put forward on that date, none of which, I continue to insist, or foreclosed by any Supreme Court or other binding precedent. You might not like Dr. Eastman's theories, you might think they had bad public policy consequences, but the important point for these purposes is that they were not foreclosed by any binding law at all. As we stand here today, we're not prepared to make that demand. It's certainly something we might, think through as a sort of thought experiment, but I think we'd be inclined not to do anything similar to what Mr. Cheeseborough has done recently. This is a complicated case. There's going to be an enormous amount of evidence. I was just going to conclude by saying this is an enormously complicated case. I can only imagine what the discovery is going to look like, and I think it's going to take some time to work through all that. That's correct. Well, he may not have a choice. From what I understand, there's at least a viable argument that if a federal officer, an actual federal officer that worked for the federal government, gets his case successfully removed, which could happen, there's a reasonable argument that the rest of the defendants may automatically be removed, whether they're federal officers or not. And so that may be what ends up happening. If that doesn't happen, we might take a serious look at that, but we haven't made a decision one way or the other. Yeah, it'll be a more difficult argument for Dr. Eastman for sure. We might take a look and see if there's some sort of an agency theory that might apply, but we haven't made any final decisions on that yet. There may be some support. I don't want to get into the weeds too much here, but there could be an argument that someone who isn't a federal employee themselves, if they worked in connection with other federal officers, as Dr. Eastman did, perhaps there's an argument there. We might take a look at that, but we haven't made a decision one way or the other. He certainly wasn't working on behalf of the federal government, and we haven't made a final decision on that. You may wind up being right. We're not sure yet. You've made the counter argument very well. Mm-hmm. I think, again, I want to answer your question directly, but I think any kind of decision, especially severance, even more so perhaps than removal, is going to be made down the road. Certainly there's benefits to going to trial apart from co-defendants. There may be benefits to going to trial with co-defendants. I'll put it like this. I think the odds we move to sever are significantly greater than the odds that we would ask for a speedy trial, put it that way. No, not at all. In fact, counsel for Mr. Trump, not anyone that represents him in Georgia, but I'm referring to Mr. Lauro, has already made fairly extensive comments to that effect in various media appearances that it absolutely is their position that Donald Trump did exactly what we would expect him to do. He had a serious constitutional question to confront around the certification of the election. So what does he do? He hires a constitutional law professor to advise him and follows that advice, and we'd have absolutely no problem if that's an integral part of the defense that former President Trump decides to mount in Georgia. That's fine with us. Dr. Eastman believes very strongly, specifically, that there were major problems with election illegalities, is the way he would phrase it, which is a slightly different concept than fraud. Dr. Eastman's contention then and his contention today is that many votes were cast in many states in contravention of the manner of the election set forth by the state legislatures, which has constitutional underpinnings. And in that, Dr. Eastman is not a voice in the wilderness. Vice President Pence made statements along very much the same lines. His chief counsel has made statements along those lines. And Dr. Eastman, yes, he does very much still maintain that view today.